Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am incredibly honored today to be here with Paul Grewal, who is the Chief Legal Officer of Coinbase. I think you and Stu are in the running for Lawyer of the Year right now. We'll see who comes out ahead.
Give the award to Stu. He's earned it.
But no, it's been, I think, the year of the lawyer, so happy to be here with you today. Just a couple quick things about Paul. He's at Coinbase now, but prior to that, he was at Facebook. And then what I'm really interested to get into today is he was a U.S. magistrate judge in the Northern District of California, and so excited to kind of hear a little bit more about how judges think about these types of things. But why don't we go ahead and dive in?
Let's do it.
I think the big thing going on here is your case that you are litigating. The SEC has, has an enforcement action against you. Why don't we just get everybody up to speed about sort of what is the status of that? What are the next steps? And where do we go from here?
Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be up here with you, Kristin, and be with all of you as well. We are in the midst of a very active, very intense case with the SEC, actually multiple cases. I'll come back to that in just a moment. In the case that the SEC brought against Coinbase here in New York, we have been preparing a briefing on a key initial question that we have in the case, which is, does the SEC even have jurisdiction over these assets and these products in the first place? We were gratified to learn, Kristin, that at our initial appearance, the court shared our view that resolving that initial question of law, that question of jurisdiction, was appropriate and in fact the right way to manage the case. And so we have filed our motion, which asks for judgment as a matter of law from the court on that question. That brief has been submitted. We were gratified that we had the support of so many amicus parties, including the Blockchain Association, which weighed in with their perspective and their views. The SEC, however, will have its chance and have its turn, as it should, in responding to our papers. That brief is going to be filed in the first week of October, and then we'll have a chance to reply after that once any amicus parties come in support of the commission. And at that point, it will be in the judge's hands to decide whether we can resolve this case as a matter of law or whether we need to proceed to full discovery and ultimately a trial before a jury.
Okay. So it sounds like some positive progress, but a long way to go. I guess there's several paths that this could take, but obviously this is a tremendous importance to Coinbase, but what does this mean for the rest of the industry, and how is this going to potentially impact either projects or other exchanges here in the US?
Yeah, well, it was very clear to us early on that the case against Coinbase was really a case against digital assets and crypto more generally. Not just because the SEC essentially labeled asset after asset that we happen to list on our exchange as securities, but also because the nature of the charges would naturally apply to all sorts of other tokens, projects, protocols, you name it, that go far beyond just Coinbase. So I do think this is a case that has significant implications for all of us in this room and all over the world. Kristin, that's one of the reasons why, as I mentioned earlier, we actually have not just one case with the SEC, but two cases. The second case is a case that Coinbase actually brought against the SEC, and we did that because for now well over a year, we have been requesting rules from the SEC that would articulate the definition of an investment contract and what types of tokens might qualify as investment contracts and therefore securities or not. What path to registration might be made available for cryptocurrency exchanges like Coinbase as well as others that would allow us all to come into and inside of the regulatory perimeter. And for now well over a year, we've received nothing but silence in return from the commission, and that's why we felt obligated to file our case against the SEC, asking that a federal court of appeals in Philadelphia order the SEC to simply provide a yes or no answer to our very basic yes or no question, which is, will you give this industry rules or not? And so we're optimistic that that's also going to help shape the landscape and bring clarity for all of us that I think we all desperately need.
Well, we appreciate you doing that on behalf of everyone. I know it's obviously a lot of time and a tremendous expense, but I think hugely hugely important. Other cases that have gone on this summer where we've had some good news, we had the Ripple case, which we had the Ripple team up here earlier with Ryan Selkis, and then we also had the Grayscale decision. How does this kind of fit into what you're doing, and how would you sort of characterize the response that the judges had in these two other cases?
Well, I think all of these cases are part of a common pattern in practice that the SEC has followed in really using litigation as a tool and pursuing a regulation by enforcement strategy that substitutes backwards-looking, one-off cases for sensible rules, a sensible framework that all of us can apply in order to follow the law and to make sure that we are operating consistent with our legal obligations. I think in each of these cases, and you mentioned several of them, the Ripple case, Grayscale, you name it, you're seeing judges in courts all over this country express a certain healthy skepticism, if I can put it that way, about the SEC's approach to regulating this industry, about their legal theories, and frankly about the record that they have either assembled or failed to assemble in order to substantiate their claim to authority over this entire industry. It's still very early days. We've only had a handful of decisions that are themselves very preliminary in nature, but I'm encouraged and frankly optimistic that the more courts and judges look at this record, the more they ask themselves these very basic questions. For example, why let this company, Coinbase, go public if you were just going to slap them with an enforcement action a short while later? I think as those questions get asked, the answers are going to come back in ways that are going to be very favorable to clarity, certainty, and frankly common sense for the industry.
Yeah, well, maybe we can talk a little bit more generally about regulation by enforcement, and can you go a little bit deeper about sort of why that is like so problematic, and maybe even take it a little bit further and talk about like what is the role of the courts in policy making, because we clearly have agencies that are trying to create policy by using the legal system. But can you comment a little bit on that, and then sort of the reverse is, what should the court's role be for policymaking?
Well, you were kind enough to mention my earlier life as a judge on the federal court myself. I think a lot about this question and this topic because in my experience, both in that service, but also in having frank conversations with my colleagues during that time, one of the things that I learned, Kristin, was that judges don't embrace their role as policymakers lightly. And frankly, they view the courts, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, as courts of last resort when it comes to setting rules and establishing policies that apply to any industry or any issue that may come before them. Another way to put it is that judges like to decide cases. They don't want to have to set standards that really are best left to regulators and lawmakers. And so it's with that reluctance and maybe even skepticism that I think most judges approach these cases. That said, I think that the judges that I know and that I've had the privilege of appearing before all understand that the primary place for policy to be made and for rules to be set is in the Congress. And that's why I think you're seeing in case after case, not only in crypto or digital assets, but in a whole series of industries, courts are really looking to Congress first and foremost to see, has the legislature given this agency the authority it is claiming? And unless that is absolutely crystal clear, we're not going to fill that gap as a court simply because an agency or an individual regulator or maybe even chairman wishes it were so.
Yeah. No, I think that's actually a very nice segue into our next topic here. There are numerous bills that are floating through Congress. I think we have a panel tomorrow that goes more in depth as to what each of these bills does, but we have one that's focused on providing stablecoin framework. We have one that fixes the broker definition issue we're working on it at the IRS. And then we have one dealing with market structure. This is the Financial Innovation Technology for the 21st Century Act, something like that, Fit for the 21st Century Act. And there's a few negative bills as well around AML. There's this Cansey bill, DAMLA, a couple others. But I think the market structure piece is a really, really important piece, and it's really important to get it right. It's got to be workable and doable, and not something that pushes people away. But can you talk a little bit about kind of your thoughts on market structure and what that should look like from a legislative perspective, and maybe even more importantly, like what would that do for the industry here in the United States?
Well, the market structure bill in particular, I think, is a critical opportunity for the United States to catch up. It's become painfully obvious to a lot of us, and of course you're very much in this conversation yourself, Kristin, that for whatever reason, America has ceded its authority and frankly ceded its historic role in setting standards for the financial industry and for industries that go well beyond finance to other countries that are much more willing to embrace that responsibility and pick up the mantle. Something like 83% now of the G20, the major economies of the world, have either passed comprehensive digital asset regulation or are in the process of doing so. And so for America, the market structure bill that recently passed the House Ag Committee and the House Financial Services Committee is a critical chance for us to finally join many, many other countries around the world in bringing sensible rules and sensible standards. It's one of the reasons, Kristin, why Coinbase has been so supportive of efforts of organizations like Stand With Crypto that are pushing the 50+ million Americans that have embraced the crypto economy in one form or fashion to tell their elected officials and tell the people who purport to represent them that they want comprehensive legislation, they want sensible rules. Of course, we all want consumers and investors protected, but we also need to promote innovation. And we think this legislation can go a great distance to finally filling that gap and catching the United States up in a way that we have too little time to waste.
Yeah, no, it's something we've spent a lot of time thinking about, and I think the devil's in the details, but if we can get it to a workable place, I think you're right, it would absolutely bring us back on board. And you touched a little bit on this earlier, but, well, actually, before I switch to this next topic, do you think we'll get a bill?
I do think we're going to get a bill through, certainly the House this year. I think the smart assessment, the smart money is on a bill going to the House floor before the end of the year. You're obviously working very hard on that. We are at Coinbase as well. It then has to go to the Senate. And getting anything through the Senate in an election year is challenging. But I always fall back, Kristin, on what makes sense. I know a lot of people, maybe even many in this room, can be skeptical that common sense has any place in passing legislation in the United States, but it actually does make a great deal of difference that what we're talking about here are basic rules defining what this asset class is, establishing a clear path to registration for cryptocurrency exchanges and other intermediaries. So I do think we have a real chance to make this happen, but it's critical that all of us, the people in this room, all 52 million Americans who have bought, sold, or otherwise engaged with digital assets, call their Congress people, write emails to Senate offices, talk, blog, tweet, all of these things in ways that make it clear to the people who are acting in our name that this is something that we care about.
Well, I hope you're right on the common sense front. I worked for a senator many years ago who referred to Washington, D.C. as 17 square miles of logic-free environment. So you never know what you're going to get with Congress. But, well, no. Well, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can go a little bit deeper. Like, what is sort of the biggest risk if Congress doesn't act and doesn't get this done? And I know you follow very closely what's going on around in other jurisdictions around the world. Like, what is at risk if we don't get this right?
Well, I think there are many important risks that Congress needs to be aware of and that we all need to be paying very careful attention to. We saw one of these risks come to life in real time last November when FTX blew up. We need to create a stable environment here in the United States that encourages businesses to either set up shop here or come to the United States and view the United States as a market where business can get done. Again, not a free pass, not a place where standards are loosened, but where sensible rules can be applied in ways that are predictable, that attract capital, that encourage job development. I mean, Kristin, think about this for a minute. It is expected that by 2030, we're going to see 1 million or more developer jobs in digital assets, Web3, and the like, and another 3 million or so jobs that go beyond just coding and building software. America's not going to get all 4 million of those jobs no matter what we do, but do we really just want to hand over well-paying, highly skilled opportunities like that to other countries just because we can't get our act together? So I do think that the time is now. I do think that other countries are just waiting to grab hold of this opportunity if we allow them. That's the challenge. The good news is there's still time to act if we choose to do so.
No, those are great numbers. I hadn't heard those on the developer numbers, so those are fantastic. I might steal those from you. But going back to just like sort of legislation generally, I think what was really interesting and amazing about the vote that happened in the committee level this year is that it was bipartisan. It wasn't evenly bipartisan, but it was very much bipartisan. How does kind of Coinbase think about bipartisanship and sort of the need to have both Republicans and Democrats supporting these bills?
Well, we think that sensible digital asset regulation not only could be bipartisan, it really needs to be bipartisan in order to be effective. As you point out, Kristin, we were all gratified, I think it's fair to say, to see nearly half a dozen Democrats on each committee join with a majority of Republicans in passing the market structure bill and the stablecoin bill that is now moving towards a House vote. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that Democrats and Republicans alike need to understand that all Americans want to see comprehensive legislation and sensible rules adopted. I mean, something like 83% of Americans have said that the current financial system is stacked in favor of incumbents. And a majority, something like 60% or more, are saying that the financial system needs a serious upgrade. Those aren't just Republicans or Democrats expressing those views. Those are all Americans saying, this is a real thing, we want to be a part of it, we want to have protections in place to be sure, but let's not just hand over this industry to other countries and other jurisdictions so that in 30 years from now, Kristin, we're going to be having the same conversation about digital assets that we're having today about who lost semiconductors or other high-tech industries that were developed in the United States but allowed to migrate elsewhere because of a lack of focus or even a hostility.
Well, and I want to get more into sort of Coinbase's engagement in Washington, but maybe as a lead-in to that, like, what is your message to builders and developers out there? Like, how can they start to get involved and make their voice heard? I mean, you mentioned folks calling their congressmen and whatnot, but how can people engage in the process in the community? And then maybe let's turn more specifically to what Coinbase is doing, because it's been just wonderful to see how it's grown over the past several years.
Well, my first message to the builders out there is to stay hopeful, stay positive, keep doing what you're doing. The number one thing that will help this industry get past this current uncertainty is to develop stuff, if I can use a technical term, that people want and that people find useful. That's going to change hearts and minds in ways that all of the lobbying and advocacy and court fights could never do, no matter how effective or productive. But a more direct way, Kristin, for people to get involved is to go to standwithcrypto.org and learn more about how to engage with your local congressman or how to call your senator. It really is about nothing more than picking up the phone or typing an email and sending it to the people who represent you, all of you, and telling them what you want. And I would suggest that one of the things that we should all want is for basic legislation to pass so that we're in the 83% of the G20 that has comprehensive digital asset legislation enacted, not the 17% that's pawing their way around this.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Coinbase. So when I was hired by the board of the Blockchain Association 5 years ago. I was sort of the first employee, and at that time, I had a sense that Coinbase wasn't really focused on Washington. They were very focused on building product and building out their services and becoming sort of the amazing company that you are today. But there's been a tremendous shift in the past couple of years, and I know it's really great. There's a whole team of people on the ground in Washington that are engaging with lawmakers and regulators and thinking through legislative language and things of that nature. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what is all part of the Coinbase policy team? What are these elements that you have that you've built out since you've arrived that are really working, where the rubber hits the road to try to get this stuff done?
Well, it is interesting. If you look at Coinbase's historical record, look, we were started by technologists. We are still very much technologist-led. And the ethos of the company will always focus on building first. I think it would be a great tragedy for Coinbase if we ever were primarily about advocacy or regulatory or legislative reform. This is a company that, again, is focused on building the future. And I think that mindset dominated our thinking for a very, very long time. When I joined Coinbase over 3 years ago, Kristin, we basically had no presence in Washington. And it became very clear to me, I think you were one of the first people I met with soon after I came aboard, that we needed to change our thinking and to change our approach, because the fact of the matter is, no matter how great the technology we were building, unless we lent our voice and lent our resources to the fight, none of that technology, or too little of it anyway, would ever see the light of day. If you fast forward to today, I'm very proud of the work that our policy and legal teams have done to educate and engage with staff members and policymakers themselves on a regular basis. That's a long way of saying we do a lot of talking to Congress, we do a lot of talking to the Senate, we talk to the executive branch and the White House often. And I think a very nice complement to that very direct form of advocacy, working in partnership with the Blockchain Association, CCI, and other organizations that are active in Washington, is supporting the efforts of organizations like Stand With Crypto to bring the 52 million Americans that I've talked about into the conversation. Not everyone will necessarily want to be involved, not everyone will necessarily have the same point of view, but our elected officials need to understand that Americans care about this. And so we're focused on helping support that effort at the same time as we're talking to our elected officials ourselves.
No, I think it's fantastic, and I think the Stand With Crypto effort is very incredibly powerful. And I think if you look at other industries, the financial services industry, their users and customers and employees don't pick up the phone to call Congress, and so I think that's something that's true. Really unique and special. So, I mean, it sounds like you've had quite an effort going on. I know you've testified a couple times. Do you think that it's working? Are lawmakers and other policymakers, are they being receptive to your arguments? And maybe also, what are those arguments that are having the most impact?
I think we need to be very sober and objective in our efforts and assessing how well we are doing. I think we are making progress. I think there is no question that the level of understanding and even the level of sympathy for this industry and this market is growing over time, but there's still so much work to be done. Kristin, what I have found to be most effective in explaining the technology and explaining why lawmakers should even care about this stuff is to focus on things that everyone as Americans should care about. Jobs. I've already talked about the 4 million or more jobs that are going to be lost to other countries unless we get our act together. National security. Crypto is an important technology that will have huge ramifications for which nations will lead in this century and beyond, and which nations will follow. It's critical for the United States and its primary role in the global financial system that crypto be built here in the United States, that there be sensible rules here in the United States to encourage that development. Those arguments, I think, are landing reasonably well with certain members of Congress. And then the final argument that I would call out, Kristin, that you can't overlook, and this is a bit more bare knuckles in terms of the politics, is the fact that if Congress doesn't act, if they don't develop sensible rules and pass a reasonable legislation, 52 million Americans, and I hope many more as they come online and on-chain, are not going to accept that. There is a certain power politics that we also have to pay attention to in this process, and I think the good news is more and more Americans and more of their elected officials are appreciating that, and so over time we're going to see that progress continue.
One final question before we wrap up. So I really do think the industry seems to be maturing in its engagement. I think I've seen it come a long way in the past 5+ years that I've been doing this, but can you talk a little bit about how the industry is working together, and maybe, I know you guys have a big event kind of next week in Washington. Can you talk about sort of how all of that is working and what you have in store?
Yeah, I share your view that I think as an industry we are doing a much better job of coordinating and also sharing ideas, sharing credit. Individual companies and entities, projects, I think are much more actively involved than they ever were before. I think our trade associations have become incredibly effective and have really come to be viewed as important resources for lawmakers who need to understand how this industry works. That's great progress. But at the end of the day, what do elected officials care about more than anything else?
Votes?
It's getting reelected. Exactly. And who does the reelecting? It's all of us in this room and all over the world who cast votes. And so that's why we're really emphasizing more than we ever have before that millions and millions of Americans need to weigh in on this issue directly if we're going to see the kind of change that we think is long overdue.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it is not one company or one organization. It takes a whole industry, and then it takes engaging at incredibly high level with sophisticated legal arguments, and then it gets down to just like, hey, this is why it's useful, and it's a lot of very personal one-on-one contact and continuing to have those conversations, and sometimes you have to have that conversation 7 times before it sinks in.
Over and over again. But you have
to do it over and over and over, and I think it's really, really great, and I think not everybody can have a team as large and sophisticated as yours, but I think even having one person in-house at a company that can, be tasked with thinking about these and staying on top of things, because I do think, it's a really communicative industry, and that we can really fire up and have an effect when we all, decide to jump in on making our voice heard together. So,
agree.
Well, no, Paul, it's a pleasure. I feel like we could sit up here all day, but I know Brian will kind of yank me off stage if I don't wrap up soon. So really appreciate everything that you're doing for not just Coinbase, but for the entire industry, because it's really, I think, brought us to the next level. And I think we're starting to get the level of respect I think we deserve. And I think a lot of that is coming from the work in the court. So thank you so much for your leadership and for being here today.
Well, I appreciate all that you're doing, Kristin. Thank you for this opportunity to meet with everybody.